So I'd like to introduce Dr. Paul Gorski. Dr. Gorski is an associate professor of integrative studies at George Mason University's School of Integrative Studies, where he teaches courses in the education and social justice concentrations. Paul is an accomplished author and editor of 12 books and has also authored and edited dozens and dozens of articles, and is an expert in the realms of equity literacy framework, racial equity in schools and school districts, poverty and class equity in schools and community organizations, and activist burnout and resiliency. He's also the founder of EdChange and the Equity Literacy Institute, and we are so incredibly excited and happy to have Paul joining us this afternoon to talk about strengthening and streamlining equity efforts in our school. I'll turn it over to you, Paul.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction. And I hope everyone's doing okay and that you and yours are safe and healthy and surviving what's happening. Kind of a crazy time. In some ways, it feels kind of weird to be doing an equity workshop in this time, and then it also feels extra necessary to be talking about equity at this time. So my plan is in essence, to do a just kind of a mini workshop online and to kind of get through some content and then just open it up for questions. And my focus is on strengthening and streamlining equity efforts in schools. The reason why, and by the way, I am going to apply, when I get to the end of this, I am going to apply some of the stuff I've been talking about specifically to this context we're facing now. But the reason why I want to talk about strengthening and streamlining equity is because I think one of the problems in schools with equity efforts, and I've worked with schools and districts all over the country, hundreds of schools, several schools and around the state of New York, and districts as well. Two things that I see are kind of the biggest holdups. I think a lot of people might think that the group of people who are just reactively against any kind of conversation about equity are the biggest barriers to equity. My experience is that that's not really true. My experience is that perhaps a bigger problem are that many of the kind of gatekeepers in schools and school districts are, well, to be honest, they're well-intended white people usually who see themselves as being committed to inclusion or diversity or equity, but are going about creating equity in ways that, to be honest, have no shot at creating more equity. And so I'm not seeing this really as a kind of blame those people thing. I'm thinking of this in terms of efficiency. How can we sort of eliminate all the things we're doing in the name of equity that don't really create more equity and really focus on, here are the things that have been proven to create more equity. And when I'm talking about equity, I'm talking both about outcomes, strengthening outcomes for all learners, but I'm also talking about experiences. This is one of the things that often gets missed in a conversation about equity, which is I can be a gay student and be getting straight A's, so that if all I'm doing is looking at outcomes, I can say, well, there's no problem there. But I could be having a miserable time in school. You know, I could be a student of color who's doing okay and involved in extracurriculars, and someone might look at me and say, well, that student's doing okay. But if I have to experience layer upon layer of racial bias, that's still not equity. So I want to talk about sort of strengthening our equity efforts by looking at them in a more complex way, and also streamlining them by making sure that we're not sort of sucked into doing things in the name of equity that really have no shot at improving outcomes or improving student experiences. So I have, I don't know, these are a lot of goals for what is designed to just be like 45 minutes, but we're going to talk about what equity is and what it means to have an equity lens, learn a couple just sort of basic equity concepts. We're going to explore what I call basic equity principles, which are a set of kind of just basic guidelines that school and district leaders can use to do that sort of strengthening and streamlining and to avoid what I call equity detours. Equity detours are the sorts of things that we put resources into in the name of equity that don't create more equity. And then I'll give you some sort of more practical things to think about. So let's start with this kind of difficult but important reflection. In essence, this is the bottom line here. And again, I think in a lot of schools and a lot of school districts filled with very well-intended people, the equity work never gets to this point. And really, this is equity work. How is racism operating right now in your school or district? If you don't know how to answer that, you cannot create more racial equity, because racial equity is about identifying the ways racial inequity operates, eliminating the racial inequity, and then putting into practice policies and procedures and pedagogies that are actively equitable. So that doesn't mean that all of a sudden all of us are going to be able to answer this question, but this is what we have to work on. How is ableism operating in your school or district, or sexism or transphobia or xenophobia or heterosexism or any of these things? That's the starting point. And the starting point is, do I know how to recognize how that stuff is operating? Again, if I can't recognize that, then I can't eliminate it. And if I can't eliminate that, then I'm not doing equity, because that's what equity work is. Identify the inequity, eliminate the inequity, implement the actively equitable policies, practices, and those sorts of things. So then the second question is, what are we doing to eliminate them? Because of course, there are people who can say, well, here are the ways racism is operating, but who don't have the will to really do what it takes to address that stuff in ways that are going to be powerful. So this is what I'd ask you to reflect on, just as a point of departure here. I know it's a hard point of departure, but you want to get serious about equity, this is what it takes to get serious about equity. So think about it. Can you name the ways racial inequities are operating in your school or district right now? Think about not just in terms of how students are treating each other, but about the curriculum, about pedagogy, about policies, about practices, about the ideologies of teachers. Can you name the ways that students experiencing poverty are experiencing inequity in your schools through policies, through practices, through the ideologies of teachers? Research shows that a majority of teachers, that is more than 50% of classroom teachers in this country, have a deficit view of students experiencing poverty. Do you know what that looks like? Would you recognize that if you were observing those teachers? And what are we doing about that? That's the starting point. That's the starting point for equity. So what we're going to do is sort of talk about some of the tools that will allow us to kind of focus on that. Now, I want to share a story that I use this framework called equity literacy. And you can learn more about it by going to equityliteracy.org. That's my organization's website, the Equity Literacy Institute. But in essence, this is what equity literacy is. Equity literacy is the knowledge and skills required to identify and eliminate inequity, and then to put into practice equitable policies and practices. Now, there are a bunch of other models and frameworks that schools and districts use to talk about equity: cultural competence, cultural responsiveness, cultural relevance. There's a million of them, right? So I want to tell you a story about something that happened when I was working with a school district that gave me a sense that maybe that we need a framework that just kind of comes at this from a little different angle. So I was working with a school district up in the northeastern part of the US in New Hampshire. And I was doing what's called an equity audit. So I was collecting a bunch of data. Basically, the idea there was to measure the extent to which the school was an equitable environment, again, in terms of outcomes and experiences for all the people in the school community. So as part of that, I was doing focus groups with different groups of students. So the very first focus group I did was with a group of African-American students. And I asked those students, just about their experience in the school and what it's like to be at that school as African-American students. And I asked them about the school's new big diversity initiative and those sorts of things. So I asked the students, what is it like here for you? And the first student responded by saying, I feel like a visitor at my own school. The second student said, I feel hyper visible here, but I also feel invisible here. This was a high school, by the way. So that student said, during Black History Month or when slavery comes up in the curriculum, everyone and the teacher expects me to be the expert for my whole community. I feel pretty hyper visible. The rest of the time, I'm pretty invisible here. So I'm hearing things like that. And then eventually a young woman slams her fist on the table, young African-American woman, and she says, I'm experiencing racism in this school. There's racism in this school and nobody's doing anything about it. So what I want you to think about there is the students who are the most marginalized students at that school, the students with really the least amount of power and how they're characterizing what the problem is. None of them was saying, what we need here is more anti-bullying. None of them was saying, we really need a kindness initiative. What they were saying is, we're experiencing racism. I'm invisible in the curriculum. I'm dealing with teachers who have racial bias. I'm experiencing racism and no one's doing anything about it. So then we go to a focus group with the upper level administrators, predominantly white group, and the principal is wearing that diversity tie that you see on your screen right there. Very well-intended guy, middle-aged white guy, not unlike myself, former diplomat. So I pose the same questions. How are things going here around this diversity initiative? And the principal, who's wearing this tie, leans back in his chair and he says, what we need to do here is celebrate the joys of diversity. And I thought, well, that's your gap. That's the gap you gotta work on. And this is equity literacy. Equity literacy is understanding the difference between there are racist policies in this school that are targeting children like me. The difference between that and you can think of that as kind of the perspective of someone who's being marginalized. What I need here is to stop being marginalized. And then you have the people with the most power, and that's not even on their radar. They're not thinking at all about, equity, about racial equity in that sense. What they're thinking about is, what we need here is more multicultural arts and crafts fairs. What we need here is more celebrating diversity. And that's the gap. And in a way, that's one of the biggest gaps in education, is that you have the people with the most power defining this in ways, we can have an international food fair every day of the school year. That is not going to make a school one lick more equitable. And that's the gap. Really, that's an ideological gap. It's not a practice gap. It's an ideological gap. That I think the way to equity is cultural competence and celebrating diversity and that sort of thing, while I have students who are literally experiencing homophobia every day they walk into the building. And that's the shift we got to make. So how do we put that at the center of the conversation? To me, that's really what this is about. Okay, so how do we build our equity literacy? I think the first question is, well, what the heck is equity? Because I hear people talk about equity a lot, but I'm not sure that we all mean the same thing. We don't really have to mean the same thing. It's okay to have some different definitions, but I do think it's important to reflect on, why am I defining it the way that I'm defining it, and how is that driving what I'm doing in my school or district? So what I want you to think about is, how do you define equity? How do you make sense out of equity? And if anybody wants to, if you want, not required, of course, but if you want to throw something in the chat box about this, you're welcome to do that. But what is equity to you? And I'd also love for you to reflect on where your definition comes from. Where your definition comes from. Now, one very popular definition of equity that people often use to differentiate it from equality is that equality means giving everyone the same thing. Equity means giving everyone what they need to be successful. And in a way, I think that that's a useful definition. See, there we go. Oh yeah, I love that. The part I love about that, April, is what they need to be their best selves. I think that's a very sort of positive, beautiful way of framing it. But so here's what I want you to think of. I think these kinds of definitions can be useful definitions, but the piece that I think gets washed away when we're talking about that are students' needs to not experience bias and inequity when they come to school. So when we think about giving every student what they need, it's easy to think about that as, well, I just need to have individual relationships with these students. I just need to know individual students. And of course, I do need to do that. And I also need to be able to recognize class bias in school policy, because students don't just need those individual relationships. They need us to stop implementing policies and practices that are marginalizing them. And I'm going to give you some examples of that. So we want to have this sort of layered way of thinking about it. So I think of this in terms of define inequity and then define equity. So what is inequity? I think of inequity as an unfair distribution of access and opportunity. So this is both material access and non-material access. So what the heck does that mean? Material access is, so think about, and you can answer this in the chat box too. What are examples of material things that cost money, that some students have access to and other students don't? The students who do have access to those things are going to be at an advantage in school. What would be an example of that? Can anybody think of an example? Arts programs, laptops, yep, great example. School supplies, absolutely. Science labs, transportation, food. Okay, y'all got this. Tutors, I think summer enrichment opportunities, you know, all of these sorts of things, right? So that's one piece of it, are these kind of material things. But there's also non-material things, which could be a little bit harder to get at, because these are things that are kind of embedded in institutional culture, that are embedded in policies. So these are things like, who has access to a curriculum that reflects people like them? Who has access to good teaching? Even, you know, research shows that the most effective kinds of teaching aren't even distributed equitably in most schools, that we can often predict which students are getting the most engaging, interactive teaching based on where they're tracked in our ability grouping and academic tracking. So even that in most schools I won't say in most schools, but in many schools is not distributed equitably. Who has access to a school where the policy is built in their image instead of some norm that they don't belong to? And I'm going to give you some examples of that. Okay, so it's this unfair distribution of access and opportunity. And I'm not, the way that I'm using distribution here, I'm not talking about, well, students come to school and we confiscate their things and then we redistribute their things. What I'm talking about in terms of my definition of equity, redistributing access and opportunity, is not about taking people's material things, but thinking about what we're doing. Thinking about policies, thinking about practices, thinking about ideologies and institutional cultures, right? So So I might think about equity as a commitment to embracing policies, practices, institutional cultures, and ideologies that are actively equitable, actively anti-racist, actively anti-sexist. Okay, so think about, for instance, something like, one example, kind of an easy example of this would be something like a tardy policy. If we have kind of an inflexible tardy policy. Now, maybe I'm a student from a middle-class family and I miss the bus, and because my mother has paid leave at her job, she can leave her job, come and pick me up and take me to school, right? So maybe I end up, not getting a tardy. But let's say I'm a student who is from a lower income family, and my mom's working a hourly wage job and does not have paid leave, and I miss the bus. So I'm much more likely to be tardy, but the policy in the name of equality is not allowing for the fact that, this is about access and opportunity in the end. And often we give our rewards to students who have perfect attendance records. And, when you look at that through an equity lens, you say, okay, what are we really rewarding there? We're rewarding who has access to healthcare. We're rewarding who has access to parents who can easily get them to school if they miss the bus or something else happens. So this kind of redistribution, again, is not about confiscating people's material things, but it's about rethinking policies, rethinking practices. And I'm going to just pause here and just tell another story. I was working with a high school, with teachers in a high school, and after the workshop, a student approached me. I don't even know how he knew why I was there, but he basically told me this story. He came out to me as gay, but he said, I'm not officially out here, but students presume he's gay, so he gets bullied a lot, but he's not officially out in his life as gay. So there were two classes where the way he had to walk from one class to the other class, where he was getting pretty ruthlessly bullied by a group of students who were calling him homophobic names and even like physically harassing him. So there was this kind of, he kind of explained there's this kind of nook in one of the hallways where he could kind of duck in and wait for those students to pass, and then he could come out and go to class and not be harassed by them. But if he did that, he was always like 15 or 20 seconds late to class. And so he had built up these tardies to this class to this point where there were these predetermined punishments that were going to start kicking in. Now, he was not comfortable. And the other thing that happened too that he explained to me was that teacher had kind of shamed him about his tardiness after he had been tardy a few times and said, everyone else can get to class on time, so what's up with you? So that teacher destroyed the possibility that this student was going to confide in that teacher, right? So he was, getting to accumulate enough tardies that he was going to start being punished. So you think about what's actually happening there is that student, because of this inflexible policy and because of these ideologies that don't have space to even consider what he's experiencing, he's being punished for the school's failure to protect him from homophobia. He's about to get suspensions in school, after school, whatever their punishments are, because the school was failing to protect him from that. Now you might say, well, if he's not reporting this, then how is the school supposed to protect him? But the school should not be waiting. Every school in whatever district or region that you're involved in, homophobia is happening all the time. Every minute in that school, it's happening. So it's not about waiting till a student reports it. It's about proactively addressing it, right? And so that student was being punished because of our failure not to do that. That's about how access and opportunity. He was going to get cheated out of instructional time because he was going to get in-school suspension because of the school's failure That's what I mean by how are policies and practices, how is opportunity being distributed through policies and practices? Okay, so one other thing I want to say about this is I have this framework that I call equity literacy arithmetic. And this is, again, is about sort of getting us focused on the things that create more equity. So let's say you start with a racist policy or a transphobic practice, and you throw in a little celebrating diversity. Maybe you have an anti-bullying program, some cultural competence, character education, and maybe you even have grit and growth mindset. And where does that land us? That still lands us at racism and transphobia and everything else, because although these things might pose as equity initiatives, not one thing on this list is there any evidence that it creates more equity either in outcomes or in experiences. And the grit and growth mindset thing is especially important here because Duckworth and, growth mindset person, somebody help me. Who's the growth mindset person? Somebody in here. Dweck. I knew it was another D. Duckworth and Dweck. So Carol Dweck has actually written articles to tell us that growth mindset is not an equity strategy. It is not meant to be targeted at students experiencing poverty or students of color or English language learners. And Duckworth has come out and said grit is not an equity strategy. And in fact, what research has shown about anti-bullying programs is that often when schools do anti-bullying assemblies or initiatives, that bullying actually increases following those sorts of things, right? So again, this is about being focused. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing, I do think we should throw grit out. I think that whole notion of grit just ideologically is doing a lot of damage. This other stuff, okay, it might have a role, but it's not equity. So what is equity? I think about 5 abilities of equity literacy. The first is just the ability to recognize inequity. And we're going to practice this in a second. And this I find is the biggest challenge. Again, when I say, can you identify 5 ways racism is operating? Everyone in schools needs to be able to do that because if I can't recognize that stuff, I can't do anything about it. The second is the ability to respond to inequity. In these student focus groups, the feedback I most often hear from students is frustration that when things do happen, when a student uses the N-word or a homophobic slur or whatever else happens, that their teachers either respond completely inadequately or don't respond. So that's a really important piece of professional development. How do we help people in schools respond to those things more effectively? So respond means how do I address in the moment? How do I respond in the moment? Redress is sort of the bigger response. How do I get at the underlying set of conditions that are happening? So if I identify one practice that is doing damage to students experiencing poverty, I don't just want to think of it in terms of what do I need to change about this one practice. I want to think about it in terms of what was it about the ideology and institutional culture here that resulted in us ever implementing this classist practice? Right, that's where we get at that deeper stuff. We'll talk more about that in a second. How to actively cultivate equity. So when we're developing policies, it's just built into the process that we're thinking about equity, How is this policy going to, serve the interests of the students who are experiencing the most inequity? And then sustain equity is, once we sort of get this rolling in a more serious way, how do we sustain our efforts? Because one thing we can be sure of is as we increase our kind of equity efforts, people who feel a sense of entitlement to having more access and opportunity than other people tend not to like it. So that's where we get parent complaints, we get community complaints and those sorts of things. So I'm not going to go through all of those slide by slide, but I do want to pause on recognizing inequity. Recognizing inequity. A couple examples I want to give you.
Paul,
Yeah,
we actually had a question from Zay.
Okay.
Great presentation, but what if you are the minority, for example, one of the few people of color? You cannot even raise issues of racism. You are regarded as bad, a troublemaker, having a chip on your shoulder. This may apply to other marginalized groups as well.
Yeah, that does. That applies to all marginalized groups, and even people who are not part of marginalized groups who are loud about these issues can experience some of that blowback. But the blowback is definitely heightened for people of color speaking up about racism, for LGBTQ peoples, or speaking up about heterosexism and homophobia and those sorts of things. I think a part of what's really important for individual people trying to create these changes in a building or in a district is to build coalitions of people who are willing to do that. I've been in a lot of schools and districts, and in all of them, there are at least a few people. And I think you also speak to one thing that I talk about this concept. It's not in this presentation, but I talk about this concept that I call institutional likability. And basically how it relates to this question is, as a white person, as a white man, I can walk into most schools and most organizations in general and know that I'm not going to be disliked or looked at with a side eye, and that I can say things about racism that my colleagues of color will be punished for saying, or will be considered to be militant, if they say the things that I've already said in this presentation. And one thing that I will say to leaders who are on this, if you're a principal or if you're at the district level, if that's true in your school or district, then that is your failure as a leader. You need to cultivate an institutional culture in your school or district where the people who are speaking up about these issues are the center of the institutional culture and are rewarded for doing that. I often say that in a lot of schools, it's actually harder to be an anti-racist than it is to be a racist. It's actually harder to be the person speaking up about these issues, that I'll be more punished for speaking up than I will be if I just go along with the biased policies and practices that are already there. So I think this is a leadership responsibility, but for those of us who are in places that don't have that leadership, I do think building coalitions and being strategic about who raises their voice when is really important. So learning how to recognize, I was working with a school district in Wisconsin, and I was walking into, there's one high school in this district. So I was walking into the high school, and outside of the high school, there was this yard sign. And the yard sign said, this was last spring, and the yard sign said, don't forget to bring your yearbook money. The early bird rate for yearbooks ends on Friday. And all of us have probably seen those sorts of things. I probably walked by signs like that 1,000 times. But this is about learning how to recognize, and this is about having that equity literacy lens. If I'm looking through this lens of equity literacy, then I could pick up on what's wrong with that practice, that early bird rate practice. And then I again have to ask, well, what kinds of other policies or practices have that same thinking gone into? So think about this. These early bird rates basically guarantee that the families with the most money are going to pay the lowest price for the yearbooks. The schools with the least amount of money, on average, are going to pay the highest prices for the yearbooks. That's the opposite of equity. Already it's inequitable that these yearbooks cost ridiculous amounts of money. So I think we need to rethink those in general. But just think about that. Now, nobody's being malicious. Nobody's meeting, you know, in the teacher's lounge saying, how can we stick it to the low income kids? But that's just about having the equity lens. And also, it's not just about that one thing, the yearbook thing. It's about the accumulation of things like that. That's why that equity lens, that's why professional development around equity really needs to focus on, can I even recognize when a policy is inequitable? Would I even know it if it was right in front of me in inequity? Right, so that piece is really important. Another thing, we have teachers who are selling extra credit. You know, bring in tissues or hand sanitizer and I'll give you extra credit. Go to this event that costs $5 and I'll give you extra credit. Right now, again, none of those teachers are being malicious. But, you know, somebody's got to have the equity literacy to say, well, wait a second here. We're distributing opportunity for a higher grade, or in the case of the yearbooks, for better social connection opportunities based on who can afford it. And of course, that should never happen in a public school. So we got to learn, we got to give people the opportunity to practice recognizing. A great way to do that is to use, you know, whatever you call your student conduct handbook, because those things are usually full of, you know, hair policies that target communities of color, tardy policies and absentee policies that have harsher impacts on lower income communities and those sorts of things. And I guarantee just after how much we've talked about this right now, if you go back and read one of those from your home district, then you'll see a bunch of things you just didn't even recognize before. That's equity literacy. Oh yeah, Greg mentions voting. That's a good example too. So I want to jump, gosh, I'm already behind here. So I was going to do 45 minutes, which gives me about 5 more minutes. So I'm going to do this really quickly. If there's one sort of key concept or idea that we can apply that I think is maybe the most crucial when it comes to equity, that's the idea of shifting people from a deficit view, a deficit ideology, to a structural ideology. Now, why is this important? Because people always say, well, that's just ideological, theoretical stuff. That's not practical. Well, we have to learn to see ideology as being very practical. I'm just going to give you a really quick example of this. We know across the country that African-American students are suspended and expelled at higher rates than white students. That is a fact that's been measured 100 different ways. That is a fact. The question from an equity view and just a good practice view is, how do I interpret that fact? Because if I want to address that as an issue, I have to have the correct interpretation of it. So I want you to think about this. Why are African-American students more likely to be suspended or expelled at higher rates? Put an answer into the chat box if you want. I'll just give you like 20 seconds if anybody wants to respond. April says implicit bias. Okay, other people might be typing in answers, but I'm gonna, just because we're kind of low on time here, I'm gonna keep going. Now, if you just looked at the most common strategies that schools are initiating in order to address this as a problem, you would think that the problem is that the perception is that African-American students misbehave more than white students. So if you ask this question, well, why is this happening? You'd have a lot of people say, well, of course, African-American students are misbehaving. And if you look at the strategies that schools are using to address this, a vast majority of those in most schools and districts are about adjusting African-American students. So we have the mindfulness room, we have the mindfulness practices, we have restorative practices, we have growth mindset, we have PBIS, we have all of these things that are really about adjusting the mindsets, the behaviors, the attitudes of African American students. The problem at a very practical level is that research shows that April is exactly right. That what research shows is this has basically nothing to do with students' behavior. What this has to do with is how teachers are interpreting behaviors differently based on the racial identities of students. And there's a whole body of research that is emerging about this that shows that especially white teachers interpret the behaviors of African American students more harshly than the same behaviors in white students, and the teachers don't even see themselves doing that, right? That's why ideology is important. There's a problem that's an ideological problem that can't be fixed with a practical solution if we don't change the ideology, right? So if we just try to implement PBIS but leave the racist ideology in place, that's not going to solve the problem. But that's what most schools are trying to do in order to solve the problem. Okay, so let's talk about what these ideologies are. Deficit ideology. People who have a deficit ideology believe that the source of disparities exist within communities of color, within low-income communities, within English language learning communities. So they see the marginalized group as the source of the problem. So all the strategies are about, well, how do we fix the marginalized group? How do we fix the attitudes and behaviors of African American students? How do we convince families, lower income families, to care more about their kids' education? When, by the way, every bit of research since the 1960s has shown that families experiencing poverty have the exact same attitude about the value of education. Again, that's an ideological thing, but it's very practical, because what that means in that case is that to improve engagement of lower income families, a practical strategy like, well, we need to convince them that they should care more about their kids' education, which a lot of schools are trying to do, that's just a bad strategy, right? Based on bad ideology. So the problem with deficit ideology is that people are so focused on what do we need to fix about students of color, what do we need to fix about low-income students or whoever it is, that we don't even talk about the inequities, the barriers, the biases, the injustices. You know, what are the conditions that make it harder for families experiencing poverty to get to their children's schools to engage in stuff. Okay, so the second ideology is called grit ideology. Grit ideology, we might recognize the barriers and inequities, but we see the disparities not as a result of those, but as a result of a lack of grit and resilience. So our focus, again, is not on eliminating the barriers, but on how do we help students become more resilient against the barriers. One example of this from a middle school that I worked with was that they had an issue where there were growing numbers of sexual assaults, male on female, student on student sexual assaults. So they're trying to figure out how to address this. And the strategy they came up with was to provide self-defense classes for young women in the school. So how do we make young women more resilient against the sexual assault rather than addressing the sexual assault as an issue of sexism and power and those sorts of things? So what we want to get to is called a structural ideology. Structural ideology is about my impulse. If I have a structural ideology, what are the challenges and barriers? So I see, for instance, let's say we have this gap. Students experiencing poverty are not doing as well in wealthier schools. If I have a deficit ideology, my impulse, the way I interpret that is, what do we need to fix about students experiencing poverty? What do we need to fix about families experiencing poverty? And that is just going to get us some more inequity. What we want to cultivate is what's called a structural response. That is, what are we doing to create the barriers and the inequities? What are the barriers? What are the inequities? What are the oppressions? What are the biases? How do we eliminate those? That should be my impulse, not what do we need to fix about these kids, what do we need to fix about those kids. Yeah, Zay makes a good point here about internalized oppression. And I do think, I have seen that operating across gender, across race, across sexual orientation, and a bunch of other things. And I think sometimes in schools, that internalization is partially about just how do I survive the culture here? Because if I keep pushing against this, I'm creating a hostile environment for myself. So I'm just trying to survive in this work. I think for other people, if they have gotten to a certain sort of level of success, they might see some reward in identifying with the privileged group as opposed to their own identity group. Of course, the problem with that is the people in the privileged group are never going to fully allow that person all the access and opportunity they have, in the privileged group. So that is a challenge. What Zay mentions there is a challenge, but I have to even see that challenge through that kind of structural lens. That's actually, in a way, a kind of reasonable and predictable response to the layers of inequity and injustice. Sometimes when I go into schools, the people who are the most resistant to this move from a deficit lens to a structural lens are people who say, I grew up in poverty, I got out of poverty through hard work, so that's what everyone else, and if I did it, anyone else should be able to do it. So there's that notion of, the danger of the single story, where I can just use my experience and say, well, that's going to be everyone's experience. And really, I think what's often happening there is that person sees some benefit of identifying with, the group, the economic group that they're in right now, and they don't want the bigotry and all the stuff that they experienced there. Yeah. Yeah, Julian says the myth of meritocracy. That's exactly right. So we don't have time I need to jump forward a little bit. But one thing that I do work a lot when I'm working with schools is how to cultivate this shift from a deficit lens to a structural lens, especially because a lot of people are very socialized into that deficit lens. So, the impulse should be, what are the out-of-school challenges and barriers? For instance, what are the barriers, inequities, oppressions that, let's say, students experiencing poverty, experiencing outside of school that impact their experiences in school? Well, things like, I don't have access to healthy food. I don't have access to high quality housing. I don't have access to healthcare, right? Even though we in schools can't completely eliminate those gaps, understanding the impact they're having is really important to understand students' experiences. Even though I, as an individual educator, might not be able to wipe out global racism, I should be doing my part in that, but also I need to understand the impact that that's having on students, because that's going to impact how they see me how some of them might see me as a white teacher, how they experience my curriculum and those sorts of things. But also, what are the in-school challenges and barriers? What are the barriers we're putting up as educators? And again, look at policy documents, student conduct documents. Those are usually full of inequitable policies matched with very judgmental and sort of finger-waggy kind of language. You could also flip the question and say, what are we doing in schools that create advantages? That's another great way to look at policy documents. Look at the student conduct handbook and say, how are these sets of policies actually creating advantage for wealthier students, for white students, for students whose families speak English at home, or whatever the group is? Okay, so I want to just talk about just a basic set of equity principles. Again, when I'm doing workshops in schools, usually I have a much longer time, so I'm using more examples and applying more practical stuff. We're short on time, so I'm just trying to hit some of the basic conceptual stuff. So I have these things, I call them the principles of equity literacy. And these are really just a set of guidelines to help us really stay focused on the kind of equity that we've been talking about in this workshop. So the first one I call the direct confrontation principle. I'm not talking about directly confronting people, although we do have to do that sometimes. What I'm talking about, again, is that idea of identify the racism, eliminate the racism, not identify the racism, help students cope with the racism, not identify the racism, then celebrate diversity because that feels more comfortable than confronting the racism. Identify all the inequities that exist, address the inequities that exist directly, changing policies, changing practices, working on institutional culture, and those sorts of things. Karen, we do definitely have time for questions. Right after I get through this set of principles, I'll jump into the questions. The second principle is called the prioritization principle. This is about, if we want to shift from that equality view to the equity view, we got to realize some students have this level of access and others have that level of access. The only way to redistribute access is to actively prioritize the students who have been cheated historically out of access. So we prioritize the interests. And here's an example of this. I'm carrying forward this example of class of poverty. What if we completely rethought how we did family engagement so that we did it in a way that prioritizes access to the lowest income families, that takes all of the constraints that they experience into consideration. We build our whole model around that. Wealthier families can adjust to that. Families experiencing poverty cannot adjust to us doing family engagement in a ways that assumes everyone's middle class and has access to transportation, has access to paid leave, has access to childcare and all those other sorts of things. So we develop policies that actively prioritize the interests of students until we have that equitable playing field. Ideology principle, shifts in practice are not enough. Giving teachers with racially biased ideologies strategies to teach students of color, that doesn't work. Shifts in practice, we know from research, are only sustainable if they are matched with shifts in ideology, right? So our equity initiatives have got to be about shifting ideology, not just this practice or that practice. I'm going to skip this one for the sake of time. Fix injustice, not kids principle. Equity efforts should, again, never focus on adjusting the mindsets, the cultures, the attitudes, the behaviors of people from marginalized communities. They should always be focused on adjusting the policies and the practices and the institutional culture that is marginalizing people in marginalized communities. And that's a deficit to structural ideology thing. So if you can kind of adopt an equity approach that is just based around those principles, that will go a long way in really keeping you focused so we're not taking these detours. And I would like to encourage everybody I wrote an article called Avoiding Racial Equity Detours. Avoiding Racial Equity Detours. And you could just do a Google search of that and find the PDF for it and read it. That talks about these principles, but it also talks about some of the deep common detours that schools use. So I want to get to Karen's question. Can you provide insight about how schools and districts can sustain equity work? Part of the hard thing about sustaining equity work is that you need leadership who is invested, and you need that leadership to stick around. The biggest problem, I've seen two big problems. One is leadership comes in who's committed to it, then they leave, then the next leadership is not committed to it. I've seen that, or I've seen there's a commitment and then powerful people in the school community or the larger community start to complain. And because leaders don't want controversy, they roll back the efforts or they fluff up the effort. So I think having leadership in place, but I also think a lot of individual educators, teachers, counselors, school psychologists, and social workers who are into this, they often burn out pretty quickly because they find if they speak up, they keep getting, and again, this to me is a leadership issue. If those people are burning out in your school, you are failing as a leader, because what that means is you're allowing an institutional culture to fester, which is doing damage to the people who are committed to the thing you say you're committed to. So I think it's about leaders going out of their way to make sure that the people who are speaking up about this, that you're building the institutional culture around them and that you're rewarding them. And that's how you grow that group, because other people say, oh, well, if I get on board with this. So I'd say those things. And I would say professional development that is truly shifting people's ideologies and belief systems, not focused on just practical strategies, because that's not sustainable, or B, that's not focused on whatever the shiny new initiative is that really doesn't have anything about equity, but we're doing it as equity because that helps people be helps, for instance, white people be more comfortable in conversation about racial equity. By shiny new things, I'm talking about things like SEL, trauma-informed practices, things that can be valuable in a school that has an equity commitment, but in a school that doesn't have an equity commitment, those things are always applied in ways that just reflect the lack of the equity. Okay, we're over time here. So
We are. I just, and again, Paul, I want to be respectful of your time, and thank you so much for this session, and thank you for all of you who participated and shared your thoughts and your experiences and your questions. Just wanted to see, is there anybody else who had any last thoughts or questions that they wanted to put out?
I'm on a I was on a video meeting. So I just finished. You might just finish.
I'm going to mute Dawn for a second. Does anybody else have any other questions or thoughts that they would like to share out with the group before we bid adieu? But again, I think, Paul, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for going through. It's wonderful when we get to spend time with somebody who's as passionate about the work and can really give some kind of actionable guidance to it. And of course, we are in extremely unusual times where a lot of these issues are exacerbated. They're not new issues, they're just being put through a different lens, but certainly your thought process and stepping us through it has been really, really valuable. And thank you for being here today. We really do appreciate it.
yeah, my pleasure. And I had these some more practical pieces at the end that we didn't get to because we just ran out of time with the questions and stuff. So if anybody wants a copy of the PowerPoint that has that stuff embedded in it, just email me at this email address. Also, on the Equity Literacy Institute, we're developing these free online self-paced modules that kind of deal with some of the things we've been talking about here that you can share with colleagues or go through yourself for free. So if you want to see any information about that, just go to equityliteracy.org and you can find that there. So
well, terrific. And again, thank you so much. And thank you for giving up your time and your thoughts. And, thank you for setting us, for the week. I think having this on a Monday, right? Equity work is ongoing and it is difficult to sustain, but certainly it provides a really important lens that I'm sure all of us will be thinking about as we go forward through this week and beyond. But thank you again for your time, Paul. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody else who also participated today. Have a wonderful day.